Hello, and welcome to Odaacity with Ayantu and Siade. Here at Odaacity, we bring you informed and diverse discussions on the most contentious issues that matter most. The Odaacity podcast is a forum for deliberation, fresh ideas, and critical thinking on current affairs. In this episode of Odaacity, we switch up directions a bit from the previous episodes and lead you through an exploration of the Oromo diasporic identity. What is belonging? How, as immigrants, do we form our identities far away from the places we were born? Is there room for multiple narratives of the Oromo identity? And if not, how do we expand and cultivate new experiences in new lands and cultures into the evolution of Oromo identity in an ever-growing diasporic population? In a TED Talk a few years ago, prolific Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie spoke of the danger of a single story. When she was a young girl in Nigeria reading English books, she believed that if she aspired to be a writer in the world of literature, that she would have to write about topics unfamiliar to her, since that's all she had read about.
That is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are.
Adichie further spoke about the role of power in storytelling. We've all heard the adage, history is written by the winners, which is a colloquialism which speaks volumes on the dynamics of power and how it shapes history. On power, Adichie writes, "It's impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. Power is the ability not to just tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. Often, as immigrants, we hold on to stories told to us by our parents, our families, and communities as a way to preserve the psychological continuity of our identity and to honor the lived experiences and sacrifices of those who made our arrival in a new land possible. But what happens to the lived experiences of the first-generation immigrant? And what about those stories? Are they not relevant for the psychological continuity of the generations to come?"
My path to learning about my identity or learning about my dad's background was a meandering path. My dad didn't really talk too much about that aspect of his identity. And so one day when I went home on a break, I talked to my dad and I asked him, was he an Oromo? And he said yes. So I learned about my Oromo identity through an African historian who was married to a Somalian. So, you know, in part anyway. So it was a kind of meandering path. And it still took me a couple of years after that to really sort of understand more about the Oromo.
Okay.
So, my family came through the, what's it called? Like the lottery process, or the visa process. But my dad had studied in London before, so he was also able to apply to get the whole family to move over all together. And yeah, I was 6 years old, so no one actually told me we were permanently moving. they got me to agree by telling me that we were going to a friend's wedding. So I was like, cool, I'm just going to go for a wedding and I'll be back. I'm not going to miss out on that much with my friends and I'll get to see them soon. And then we actually got to DC, and the woman who was supposed to be married was pregnant and had a baby that night. So at that point I realized we weren't going back, and I was not happy, and it took a very long time for me to be okay with actually living here. I don't know, I was just very frustrated at going from having friends, like having a life there, to not being able to understand anything, not able to communicate with anyone, no friends. I was 6, but at the same time, it was so frustrating going to classes and having to go to special classes to learn English, and everyone thinking you were stupid just because you didn't understand the language. Yeah, so transitioning here was not fun for me.
It was just a lot to take in, but something struck a chord, and I still remember the first time I ever was introduced to Oromo dance. My aunt Kue was, she took the top of a garbage can and used that as a shield, and took a broomstick and used it as like an able, a spear, and she was saying, waranu, waranu, warani, waran, and that's the first time that I ever, encountered like this culture, this other culture, and it just was like so vibrant and lively, and I was like, this is cool, this is awesome.
In his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Dubois introduced the concept of double consciousness into the arena of race studies in the United States. Double consciousness describes the individual sensation of feeling as though your identity is divided into several parts, making it difficult or impossible to have one unified identity. While Dubois spoke of this within the context of race relations in the United States, it's easy to extrapolate and apply the concept to the immigrant experience, and this is especially true for first-generation immigrants.
I think the strategy that my parents used, if we call it a strategy, they might have just been living their life, was to just expose me to things. They never really formally sat me down and said, you are Oromo, and this is what Oromo people do, and this is how they talk, and this is their language. They just exposed me to it. But I think some of that formal conversation came from those extraneous people that were around us. So the guests that came over to the house, or like the refugees that were new to the country and my parents would kind of take in, they were the ones that would kind of sit me down and say, well, do you know where you're from? And do you know the story and history of the Oromo people? Do you know the language? Can you understand it? And things like that came from outsiders, not so much from my parents. My parents did, which I think is a great thing, just exposed me to it and allowed me to sponge it in. They would explain things to me if I didn't understand them. If I mispronounced something, they would laugh but didn't tell me how to pronounce it correctly and things like that. So they were very, very warm and welcoming, and I felt fine. I don't think I started feeling that disconnect until I started my teen years, because you're coming into young adulthood, and I started to compartmentalize. Whereas I had the Oromo world, which was over here somewhere, and then I had the rest of the time where I'm at school or with my friends who are not Oromo, and I just never let those two worlds collide. So I had to constantly navigate two cultures, which at the time felt frustrating. Even till recent years, it feels frustrating. But I now know that it is a skill that very, very few have, to be able to navigate other cultures, because I found myself able to understand people from cultures outside of America a little bit easier just being a first-generationer.
Scholars also often use the word hybridity to describe the diasporic identity. Hybridity is the natural result of undergoing constant change and adaptation, and it raises questions about one's own identity and internal kaleidoscopic landscape. The question then becomes, who do I represent? A passage from Hua's Diaspora and Cultural Memory states, those living in diaspora have a double perspective. They acknowledge an earlier existence elsewhere, and have a critical relationship with the cultural politics of their present home, all embedded within the experience of displacement. Another emerging term in diaspora studies, which describes the internal landscape of the immigrant child, is the third culture kid, or TCK.
In the community in the diaspora, I remember learning about third culture kids and realizing how much that actually was my life. That there was the original culture that my parents are from, where technically I'm from since I was born there. And then there's the culture that I came into, and then the culture that was created by who I am as an individual, like the molding, like the blending of the two cultures. But at the same time, when I am a third culture kid, and I do have that third culture, neither of the other two cultures recognize that. They never fully understand that I can take both of those, and I can be my own person. Like, culture allows for individual expression, and it shouldn't be that there is one way to be Oromo, one way to be American. That doesn't actually make sense.
The experience of being a TCK is unique in that these individuals are moving between cultures before they have had the opportunity to fully develop their personal and cultural identity. One of the challenges of being a third culture individual is developing a sense of belonging, commitment, and attachment to a culture. According to cultural theorist Paul Gilroy, ethnic absolutism is the idea that all ethnic minorities have the same norms and values. While this view is usually held by ethnic majority groups, we must be cautious about unconsciously applying this same limitation to ourselves as Oromos. It's also important to be cautious of diasporic discourses that tend to homogenize difference and multiplicity.
Going to China was definitely an eye-opening experience where not only did they not really know what an Oromo was, they hadn't really seen a black woman in general. So going there and feeling like I not only represented Oromos, I also represented Americans, I also represented any black woman in the world. And it was something that I understood instantly when people would stop and take photos on the street, just because they don't see that many people of color in China. And I knew how far the idea of Oromo was from those who were viewing me. I saw it as an opportunity, maybe to educate people, but it did feel like going back to basics, where people sometimes will just look at you and categorize you based on that and won't dig any deeper. And what do you do with that? Do you use that opportunity, or do you just portray whatever stereotypes that they have in their mind? Do you even engage to that level? Or do you just avoid it and let them think whatever it is that you think that they're perceiving of you and keep moving forward? Those kind of thoughts came through my mind as I was in China.
In 100 years, these varied and diverse stories, some of which we've heard today, of departure, arrival, longing, belonging, and identity from around the world in our diasporic experience will only strengthen our collective narrative, our collective memory, and ensure the continuity of the lived experiences of not only our ancestors, but of the generations to come. In summary, this is just the first of what we hope will be many more conversations on identity and belonging. What are some of your thoughts of the diasporic experience? Feel free to share or comment on Facebook, Twitter, or SoundCloud. Also, if you have ideas for the show and or suggestions for guests you'd like to hear, please let us know. You can email us at theodacity@gmail.com. That's theodacity with 2 A's at gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at The Odaacity Podcast. Thanks again for listening to Odaacity with Ayantu and Siade. See you next time.